a Roberto por su nombramiento como historiador oficial de la ciudad de Buenos Aires para el año 21 también.
Gracias, lo único que espero es que no me
por...
hagan bailar el tango en ocasión de la entrega, porque seguramente me lo quitan.
Vamos a esperar el fin de la pandemia y vamos a ver.
Ya lo creo.
Perfecto. Así que estamos esperando ahora la entrada de la...
Empezamos.
Perfecto.
Buenas tardes,
Muy bien.
bienvenidos. Hoy nos convoca el homenaje para conmemorar el centenario de la misión diplomática de la Irlanda independiente en Argentina y en América Latina. Durante la charla, les solicitamos mantener sus micrófonos silenciados para evitar interferencias. El chat se encuentra activo para realizar preguntas y comentarios que le acercaremos a los panelistas al finalizar la presentación. Contaremos con interpretación simultánea inglés-español. Para activarla, deben seleccionar el símbolo del mundo en el menú de Zoom y luego seleccionar español o inglés. El ciclo de Cultura y Estudios Irlandeses se enmarca en la Cátedra Extracurricular de Estudios Irlandeses de la Escuela de Lenguas Modernas, creada en 2015 y auspiciada por la Embajada de Irlanda en la Argentina. Tal como se enuncian los objetivos de la cátedra, se promueve la difusión de la cultura irlandesa en sus manifestaciones lingüísticas, literarias e históricas, y en las de los inmigrantes irlandeses en la Argentina y sus descendientes. La Asociación de Estudios Irlandeses del Sur se propone el estudio y difusión de Irlanda, su cultura, su lengua, su literatura, su arte, su historia y su sociedad, entre otros aspectos, en particular en relación con la diáspora en la región sur de América. El estudio de la vida de los irlandeses en la región, de sus descendientes y de las comunidades que fundaron, de sus aportes a las sociedades de la región y a contribuir la preservación de su identidad. El Centro de Estudios Salvador, dependiente de la Asociación Civil Universidad del Salvador en Uruguay, se encuentra al servicio de la difusión de la cultura y de la formación y capacitación de la comunidad. En conjunto, buscamos promover la difusión de los estudios irlandeses y a la vez propiciar un ámbito de reflexión y diálogo entre Irlanda y Argentina y la región, en virtud de los vínculos que nos unen desde la literatura, la historia, las relaciones internacionales y los estudios culturales. Mi nombre es Paula Ortiz, soy directora de la Escuela de Lenguas Modernas de la Universidad de El Salvador y vicepresidente de la Asociación de Estudios Irlandeses del Sur, AES. Centenario de la misión diplomática de la Irlanda independiente en Argentina y América Latina. En 1921, Laurence Ginnell fue nombrado por el nuevo gobierno irlandés como enviado especial de los gobiernos de Sudamérica. Las cartas credenciales de Ginnell, quien había sido parlamentario por el condado de Westmeath, fueron firmadas por el presidente del nuevo parlamento en Dublín, Eamon de Valera. Ginnell llegó a Buenos Aires en julio de 1921 con el objetivo de recaudar fondos y buscar apoyo político y diplomático en Argentina y en Latinoamérica para el nuevo Estado independiente. En este evento, diversos historiadores abordarán la carrera de Ginnell y los detalles de su misión diplomática, incluyendo su delicada relación con el gobierno de Irigoyen. También harán mención a los viajes de Ginnell en Argentina y sus estrechos contactos con la comunidad hiberno-argentina. Se hará referencia al rol de su esposa, Alice Ginnell, y al de Anita Bulfin, hija del periodista y escritor William Bulfin. Dos historiadores argentinos hablarán del contexto político y social en Argentina en 1921 y las relaciones complejas entre Buenos Aires y Gran Bretaña. Nos acompañan hoy y dirán unas palabras de bienvenida la embajadora de Irlanda en Argentina, Jackie O'Halloran-Bernstein, y la embajadora de Argentina en Irlanda, Sandra Moira Wilkinson. Jackie O'Halloran-Bernstein, designada por el gobierno irlandés como embajadora de Irlanda para Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay y Uruguay en 2018, posee una maestría en Historia Medieval por la University College Dublin e ingresó al servicio exterior en 1987. Representó a Irlanda en el seminario UE-CELAC organizado por Argentina en 2013 sobre violencia de género y es miembro del Comité Nacional de Mujeres del Congreso Irlandés de Sindicatos. Adelante, Jackie.
Muchísimas gracias, Paula. Y la verdad es un honor para mí brindar estas palabras en un evento tan especial en el centenario de la visita argentina del enviado especial del gobierno de Irlanda, Laurence Ginnell, y su esposa Alice. Quiero agradecer muy especialmente a mi colega, la embajadora de la Argentina en Dublín, Moira Wilkinson, por su presencia.
Primero, así hago la subdelegación que quiero hacer. Entonces no hace falta cambiarla.
Así como también a la parte de la familia Ginnell que está participando desde Irlanda. Quiero agradecer a la Asociación de Estudios Irlandeses del Sur y a la Cátedra Extracurricular de Estudios Irlandeses de la Universidad del Salvador por la organización de esta jornada, a los excelentes expositores que tendremos la oportunidad de escuchar y a todo el público que se ha unido a esta charla, tanto en Argentina como en Irlanda y en distintas ciudades del mundo. El centenario de esta visita es una muestra de las profundas relaciones históricas que unen a la Argentina e Irlanda y a sus pueblos. Relaciones que siguen expandiéndose en diversos ámbitos y de las que nos sentimos orgullosos. En este sentido, en ocasión del bicentenario de la independencia argentina y el centenario del levantamiento de Pascua en 2016, se publicó el libro de uno de las panelistas que tendremos el privilegio de escuchar hoy, el doctor Dermot Keogh. Me refiero al libro La independencia argentina, la conexión irlandesa. En ese magnífico volumen hemos podido apreciar los lazos entre argentinos e irlandeses durante el proceso independentista argentino y durante todo el siglo XIX. En los próximos meses, de cara al centenario de la independencia de Irlanda, se lanzará el nuevo libro del Dr. Keogh, que dejará en evidencia los vínculos entre la Argentina e Irlanda a lo largo del siglo XX. Hoy también tendremos la oportunidad de escuchar Paul Hughes, que ha realizado una residencia sobre Laurence Ginnell en el marco del programa de década de centenarios del Westmeath County Council, de donde era originario Ginnell y que además es uno de los condados con mayor vínculo con la Argentina, dado que muchísimos hombres y mujeres de sus tierras emigraron a la Argentina durante el siglo XIX. Asimismo, estoy muy contenta en poder darle la bienvenida a este encuentro a Anne-Marie O'Brien, que expondrá sobre Alice Ginnell y Anita Bulfin, dos mujeres irlandesas que estuvieron muy involucrados en esta visita y con la causa irlandesa. Este evento forma parte de la iniciativa del gobierno de Irlanda, Mino 100, lanzado por el Ministerio de Turismo, Cultura, Arte, Culto, Deporte y Prensa, y busca resaltar el rol jugado por las mujeres en la creación del Estado irlandés independiente. Creo que es fundamental destacar las contribuciones de las mujeres en la independencia de Irlanda. Me alegro mucho que cada vez más sus roles sean rescatados y reconocidos. Es una alegría también poder escuchar una vez más al historiador Roberto Elizalde, que tanto ha contribuido al estudio de los irlandeses en la Argentina y en la divulgación masiva de sus contribuciones. Así como poder escuchar las reflexiones del Dr. Diego Barovero, presidente del Instituto Nacional Irigoyeniano, que seguramente pondrá luz sobre muchos aspectos del contexto argentino en el momento en que se produjo la visita de Laurence Ginnell. Quisiera, para finalizar, una vez más felicitar a la Asociación de Estudios Irlandeses del Sur por su dedicación en la organización de estos excelentes encuentros, como el que hoy presenciaremos, y sin dudas será muy enriquecedor para todos los participantes. Estoy seguro que los expositores en sus diferentes abordajes nos permitirán comprender mejor la visita del enviado especial del gobierno de la Irlanda independiente a la Argentina al cumplirse su centenario. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Jackie. Y ahora, Sandra Moira Wilkinson, embajadora de Argentina en Irlanda, designada en el cargo a fines de septiembre del 2020, abogada y nacida en la localidad bonaerense de General San Martín, egresó en 1992 del Instituto de Servicio Exterior de la Nación, ISEN, con medalla de Economía Raúl Prebisch. En su anterior destino se desempeñó como cónsul general de la Argentina en Madrid. Bienvenida, Sandra.
Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Quiero saludar a la embajadora de Irlanda en la República Argentina, Jackie O'Halloran Benson, a las y los organizadores de este evento de la Asociación de Estudios Irlandeses del Sur y de la Cátedra Extracurricular de Estudios Irlandeses de la Universidad de El Salvador, y a las y los distinguidos expositores, y a todo el público presente en esta videoconferencia, en particular a la familia Ginnell. Hoy nos encontramos celebrando el centenario de la visita del enviado especial de la Irlanda independiente a la Argentina, encabezada por Laurence Ginnell, y que contó con la participación de su esposa Alice. La misma será fielmente relatada por los historiadores que nos acompañan. Yo quisiera mencionar brevemente algunas reflexiones sobre la nutrida relación entre Argentina e Irlanda, histórica, cercana, con valores compartidos y profundos lazos comunes. Las numerosas historias de personas que viajaron de Irlanda a la Argentina y de Argentina a Irlanda son parte fundamental de la construcción y desarrollo de nuestros dos países, cuyos lazos se remontan a los inicios de la fundación de ambos estados. Las figuras del almirante Guillermo Brown, el padre de la Armada Argentina, y de Laurence Ginnell son ejemplos de personas que junto con muchos otros construyeron nuestras historias, fortaleciendo los lazos de amistad. Hoy en día, gracias al acuerdo de vacaciones y trabajo, jóvenes de ambos países pueden estudiar y trabajar durante un año en el exterior, enriqueciendo así sus experiencias a través de vivencias inolvidables, que forjarán sus futuras decisiones profesionales. La riqueza de ese intercambio migratorio es evidente. En los ámbitos cultural y deportivo existe un intercambio enriquecedor, siendo los deportes gaélicos y el rugby excelentes ejemplares. El encuentro entre las selecciones nacionales de rugby de Argentina e Irlanda se ha convertido en un clásico mundial. Este año tocará a los Pumas enfrentar a la selección de Irlanda en la ciudad de Dublín. Para finalizar, me gustaría mencionar dos temas que llamaron mi atención entre las varias lecturas sobre el viaje de Laurence Ginnell a la Argentina y los comentarios aportados sobre el mismo. Una es la caracterización de esa misión como un ejemplo de lo que hoy llamamos diplomacia pública. El otro, más profundo y relevante, es la insoslayable participación de Alice Ginnell en las actividades de la visita, por lo que algunos lo llamaron un equipo diplomático. Precisamente, la participación de las mujeres en lugares significativos de toma de decisión es uno de los valores compartidos por nuestros dos países, siendo una prioridad la igualdad sustantiva entre varones y mujeres. Los aniversarios son hechos significativos y propicios para analizar lo sucedido, para celebrarlo y para reflexionar. Este aniversario es una ocasión para celebrar la amistad de nuestras dos naciones. Les agradezco nuevamente la invitación y sin quitarles más tiempo, les deseo éxitos en este evento que sin duda, como dijo Jackie, será enriquecedor para todos los presentes. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, embajadora. Para proseguir entonces, le doy la palabra al doctor Justin Harman, que es presidente de AES.
Muchas gracias, Paula, y bienvenidos a todos hoy para conmemorar el centenario de esta misión a la Argentina, un evento que fue una de las primeras iniciativas diplomáticas del nuevo Estado independiente de Irlanda y un reflejo de la profundidad de las relaciones históricas entre los dos países. Tenemos un panel de ponentes impresionantes para hablar de Ginnell, su vida y su obra, de los desafíos de su misión, del rol jugado, como dijo la embajadora, por su esposa Alice Ginnell y por Anita Bulfin, hermana de Eamon y hija de William. Y tenemos la presencia de dos historiadores argentinos para tratar el tema de la situación política en la Argentina en el momento de la llegada de Ginnell con el gobierno de Irigoyen. Como dijo Paula, las presentaciones hoy estarán en inglés o en castellano. Los primeros 3 oradores van a hablar en inglés y los 2 últimos en castellano. Tenemos interpretación simultánea y aprovecho esta oportunidad para agradecer a nuestros intérpretes. Sigo en inglés para presentar a nuestros primeros oradores. Welcome to everybody, whether in Argentina, Ireland or elsewhere, to this virtual event to mark the centenary of the Ginnell mission, the first mission of its emerging new independent Irish state. This mission was a reflection of what is an historic relationship between the two countries. Dermot Keogh, who's one of our speakers today, noted the following in the epilogue to his definitive 2016 volume on Irish independence and the Irish connection. He said, when the then Argentine foreign minister, Honorio Pueyrredón, received Ginnell, although in a private and unofficial capacity, on behalf of the Argentine government, he went further than any other foreign minister of that time to acknowledge the Irish struggle for statehood in the revolutionary period between 1919 and 1921. President Mary Robinson, who returned the seal of that diplomatic mission to Dublin on the occasion of her visit here in 1995, completed the enduring circle of friendship between Ireland and Argentina for the formation of the Argentine Republic in 1816 and enduring through Ireland's revolutionary period until the present day, end of quote. So the Ginnell mission was without doubt an historic event in the bilateral relationship, but also, of course, in the foreign affairs of the fledgling Irish state. And it really is wonderful to be in a position to commemorate the centenary of the arrival of Ginnell in the company of a very distinguished panel of speakers. For reasons of time, we will put up the biographical details of our speakers on the chat function. So I will just make only brief introductions of each. As I say, the first 3 will speak in English, while our final 2 contributions will Spanish. Paul Hughes, as has been marked, recently completed his doctorate at Queen's University Belfast on the Irish Republican activism of Laurence Ginnell, and he's currently writing a biography of Ginnell. And Paul will speak to us of Ginnell's life and his involvement in Irish republicanism and his role as a parliamentarian for Westmeath, both in the House of Commons in London and in the first Irish Parliament. Dermot Keogh needs no introduction to participants today, Emeritus Professor of History in University College Cork. He has been very active in researching the relationship between Ireland and Argentina over many years. He is the author, as has been mentioned, of the book published in Buenos Aires in 2016 on Irish independence and the Argentine connection. And that, of course, contains extensive material on the Ginnell mission, which will be the focus of his presentation today. His new volume, Irlanda en el siglo XX, Diplomacia, Diáspora, Iglesia Católica, Derechos Humanos y la Guerra de las Malvinas, will be published in Buenos Aires shortly. I just want to say that it is an honor for us in the association that the volume will be published under the auspices of our association. Anne-Marie O'Brien holds a PhD in history from the University of Limerick and is currently a lecturer at Maynooth University. Her book, The Ideal Diplomat, Women and Irish Foreign Affairs, was published last year, and she'll be speaking to us on the role of women and foreign affairs and refer specifically to the role of Alice Ginnell and of Anita Bulfin in Buenos Aires. Finally, our last two speakers, in order to provide a complete and rounded picture of the Ginnell mission, it's clearly important for us to appreciate the delicate political situation in the Argentina to which Ginnell arrived in 1921. And they will talk of the impact of the very significant change that had taken place in Argentina in 1916 with the election of Hipólito Yrigoyen. At the time, British commercial and business interests were predominant. In 1916, Argentina's economic dependence on Britain was such as to merit a special reference by Lenin in his volume on imperialism. Ginnell was therefore seeking the support of an Argentina which, while the radical government may have had sympathy for the cause of Irish independence, was faced with the reality of de facto structural economic dependence on the British market and active British opposition in Buenos Aires to any action on the part of the government here to express support for Ireland. So to provide this historical background, I'm delighted that we are joined by Roberto Elizalde and Diego Barovero. Roberto is well known. He's a member of the council of our association, a distinguished historian and writer. He was recently named official historian of the city of Buenos Aires for 2021. Diego Barovero is president of the Yrigoyen Institute here in Buenos Aires and a distinguished academic. On that note, I will give the floor to Paul. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. I'm just going to connect my slides. Just bear with me for 1 second. Now, can everybody see just my slides?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, great. That's good. Okay, we begin. Good evening, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, and to everyone on both sides of the Atlantic from a rain-soaked, thundery Mullingar. I'm very grateful to the organisers for inviting me to speak tonight in what is one of my last duties in my term as Westmeath County Council's historian in residence. I'm delighted to get the chance to do this for two reasons. Firstly, it's great as part of my residency to be able to acknowledge in a meaningful way the remarkable shared history between Westmeath and Argentina. Secondly, I get the opportunity to reorient my thoughts to the career of a man who has effectively been a guest in our house for the last 10 years. And what will follow here tonight, as you can see from the title of this paper, is a biographical sketch of Laurence Ginnell with a very global flavour. Amid the emergence of new source material and novel ways of studying the history of the Irish Revolution, Ginnell's place in the history of these events has become easier to define. While not operating in the first tier of the Republican leadership with figures like Michael Collins, Eamon de Valera, or even Harry Boland, Ginnell was nevertheless an important operator on the second tier. However, analysing his career through a new transnational approach to studying the period, which has become termed the Global Irish Revolution, amplifies Ginnell's importance to Irish affairs within what we might call the long decade of 1912 to 1923. I hope everyone can see the second slide, yes? In May 1922, weeks before the outbreak of civil war in Ireland, Eamon de Valera wrote to Ginnell to welcome him back from his posting in Argentina and to inquire about the state of his health. Referring to the deepening rift between former comrades, de Valera wrote, "I am sure you are very troubled at the condition in which things are, but you, who faced almost alone your opponents in the trying period 1914 to 1917, are not likely to be dismayed." This was an apt summary of the high point of Ginnell's political career, when he was at the apogee of his powers in Ireland. This was a time of contested views, not only about Ireland's participation in a global war, but also of different concepts of Irish nationality. It was a time of public defiance and protest, and with the slow death of the constitutional nationalist Irish Parliamentary Party after the rebellion of Easter 1916, it also became a time of political vacuum in Ireland. Born in Delvin, County Westmeath in 1852, Ginnell's childhood resembled something of a Dickensian Bildungsroman, that is, a story of poverty and adversity overcome by opportunity and personal development. The opportunity came via Ginnell's eldest brother, Andrew, the only Ginnell sibling initially put through formal education, who landed an apprenticeship as an engineer with the help of a benefactor. Andrew's carving out of a career led to opportunities for his younger brothers. For Laurence, it meant a posting as a timekeeper and a measurer of works on the construction of the Limerick and Kerry railways, and this in turn led him in two directions, marriage and politics. The first unfortunately ended in tragedy. His wife, a shopkeeper in Listowel, County Kerry, died in childbirth in June 1883. The second path involved the forging of connections, which by April 1885 secured Ginnell a position as a registrar within the Irish National League, the vehicle for Charles Stewart Parnell and his Irish Parliamentary Party. So by the turn of the 20th century, after working as private secretary to the prominent nationalist politician John Dillon, the self-educated Laurence Ginnell had qualified as a barrister. He had also established a decent reputation as a commentator on Irish legal history. His 1894 book on Brehon law was widely reviewed, as was his subsequent study of the papal bull Laudabiliter, the document invoked by the English King Henry II to back his claim to lordship over Ireland. Ginnell questioned the authenticity of the bull, and on the publication of his thesis in 1899, he presented it to Pope Leo XIII in the Vatican. Ginnell worked as a paid secretary at the offices of the newly formed Irish nationalist organisation, the United Irish League, for a number of years until his election to the British House of Commons in 1906. He had tried and failed to win election to Parliament in 1900. In 1902, he married Alice King, 30 years his junior, a cultured and politically radical daughter of a Mullingar-based nationalist, James King, beginning over 2 decades of a formidable political team. 4 years later, Ginnell was finally elected the MP for North Westmeath. Immediately setting himself apart from the party flock, in the autumn of that year he launched the Ranch War, the last major agrarian agitation in Ireland prior to the revolutionary period. Described by the London Times on his death in 1923 as, quote, the inventor of cattle drives, Ginnell pioneered the use of this agitational weapon, fascinating onlookers as far away as the United States, where cattle driving was no more than a romanticized form of Gilded Age economic activity. To internationalize, he was so intimately associated with the subject of the land that when he arrived in the US on a Dáil mission in 1920, American newspapers erroneously described him as Minister for Agriculture in the Irish Republican government. Ginnell's efforts to convert the vast cattle holdings of rich farmers into tillage land, benefiting poor smallholders and the landless, made him a household name in Ireland and in Britain gave him the reputation of a sort of highwayman who wore a top hat. It was a reputation which, by Christmas 1907, earned him a brief spell in prison. I might point out at this stage the slight contradiction between Ginnell's crusade against ranch farmers in Ireland and the fact that when he arrived in Argentina many years later, many of the people he sought support from were Irish Argentine estancieros, owners of large livestock holdings. On his emergence from Kilmainham jail in April 1908, one of Ginnell's first ports of call was to consider a trip to Argentina for a lecture tour. He was perhaps encouraged in this direction by a man named William Ginnell, his political ally in County Longford. Ginnell was a native of Westmeath and a nationalist who was moving increasingly towards a Sinn Féin outlook, and he had spent many years living and working in Argentina before returning to Ireland. So Ginnell wrote to the Southern Cross editor William Bulfin for advice as to whether such a trip would be worth his while. These, however, were the days when members of the House of Commons were unpaid, and as Ginnell had limited means at the time, he decided against sailing to South America at this time. Maverick MP for North Westmeath spent the best part of the next 3 years looking on as any support for his ranch war campaign faded among the upper echelons of the Irish Party, led by John Redmond. Meanwhile, pushing for a more hardline nationalist stance within the party, he battled accusations of promoting Sinn Féinism and causing factionalism. The party did its best to get rid of him at its fiery 1909 convention and later in the general elections of January and December 1910. With solid support in rural North Westmeath and a hastily convened fighting fund ensured that against the odds, Ginnell kept his seat in Westminster. Let's get a drink. Apologies, everyone. So, following these elections, the Irish Party were now the kingmakers in the House of Commons, and they supported Herbert Asquith's Liberal government in exchange for more robust action on securing Irish Home Rule. This left Ginnell in somewhat of a political wilderness, but he came up with new and innovative ways to stay in the spotlight. In late January 1911, he sparked a 3-week-long running controversy after accusing the Speaker of the House of Commons, James Lowther, of partiality in choosing which MPs could speak on a given topic. In Britain and around the world, Ginnell had his fair share of sympathisers in attacking this system, by which the Speaker tended to choose contributors to debates based on lists submitted by large political parties. But it was the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 which really thrust Ginnell onto the global stage. When John Redmond's Irish Parliamentary Party opted to pledge Irish support for Britain's war effort in exchange for an acceleration of Home Rule legislation, Ginnell, who was by now totally independent of the party, took a different approach. Of the 103 Irishmen sitting in Westminster, Unionist MPs included, Ginnell was the only one to oppose Irish involvement in the war on general principle, insisting on a concept of Irish neutrality, which left British ministers bemused. And ironically, it was the latitude given to him by the Speaker of the House on foot of those accusations he had made against him in 1911 that gave Ginnell carte blanche to pursue persistent attacks on what he viewed as the financial and oligarchical wire pullers controlling government war policy. To give you some illustration of the sheer volume of his wartime contributions in Parliament, we can have a look at this graph, which I hope everyone can see. This graph is based on data drawn from the British Parliamentary Record, Hansard. To put Ginnell's wartime impact in context, between 1914 and 1917, he made 2,972 contributions in Westminster, more than double that of the combined output of Irish Party leader John Redmond and his main lieutenants John Dillon, T.P. O'Connor, and Joe Devlin. Ginnell's eccentricity and his harsh voice, his often wanton disrespect for parliamentary procedure, and his ability to hand out copies of his speeches in perfect Pitman shorthand meant that both foreign and domestic reporters in the press gallery generated extensive copy from his diatribes and interrogations. Emerging nationalities looked on with admiration at his activities. For example, in December 1915, both Laurence and Alice Ginnell were treated to a lavish dinner by Egyptian nationals residing in London as a way of thanking him for making representations on their behalf in Parliament. Between this and his repeated articulation of the concept of Irish neutrality, Ginnell can surely be regarded as one of the originators of an inchoate, independent Irish foreign policy. At home, his stances earned him the moniker the Member for Ireland. So Ginnell's international platform in the so-called Mother of Parliaments and his robust support for the spirit of the 1916 Rising left him ideally placed to shape the narrative after the rebellion. This was the case both inside and outside of Westminster, the latter in the form of his frequent visits to prisons holding thousands of Irish internees arrested after Easter week. With Britain eager to involve the United States in the ongoing war against Germany, high-ranking British officials were concerned at what impact Ginnell's questions about conditions in Ireland or the welfare of Irish prisoners and their families was having on opinion at home and abroad. Evidence of these concerns can be found, for example, in a May 1916 letter from Herbert Samuel, British Home Secretary, to King George V. Meanwhile, leading American newspapers took an increasing interest in Ginnell's statements, with one Irish-run paper, the San Francisco Leader, describing him as the second most powerful man in Ireland. Far from indulging a man of destiny complex, Ginnell did what he could from 1916 through to 1917 to contribute to building a new political consensus in Ireland. He played a leading role in campaigning for the election of separatists in the crucial North Roscommon, South Longford and East Clare by-elections, before deciding himself to leave the House of Commons and return to Ireland on a permanent basis. Elected as joint treasurer of the newly constituted Sinn Féin movement, he was appointed to its food committee and sought to infuse the entire project with a radical agrarian tendency. Another fascinating feature of Ginnell's activities in 1917 was a decision by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, of which Ginnell was not a member, not as far as I can ascertain, to outsource to him their efforts to establish contact with the revolutionaries who came to power in Russia following the February Revolution. Correspondence between two leading IRB men, Patrick McCartan and Seamus O'Doherty, suggests that people in the Russian Provisional Government were impressed by Ginnell's reputation and insisted that he act as an intermediary between the IRB and the Russian Provisional Government's representative in London, a physician by the name of Dr. Jacob Gavronsky. Now, in March 1918, this multifaceted phase of Ginnell's career came to an end when he was imprisoned for encouraging cattle drives and land seizures, and he remained in captivity for much of the ensuing 2 years. While incarcerated, he wrote letters to US President Woodrow Wilson, penned a justification of Ireland's claim to independence, which was later published, and fought an election campaign. In December 1918, he was one of 73 Sinn Féin candidates returned in that election, who subsequently abstained from Westminster and took their seats in Dublin's Mansion House in the body that became known as Dáil Éireann. When Ginnell was released from Reading Jail in March 1919, he took his seat in the Assembly and worked a brief stint as the first Dáil's Director of Propaganda. In June 1919, he ended up back in prison, and with his health completely shattered, he withdrew to the Aran Islands in the west of Ireland on his release in September. Ginnell was again arrested and briefly interned after his return from the West, and his worsening health condition prompted him to go abroad. Again, he returned to the subject of going to Argentina, and he applied to the Dáil for an allowance to travel to Argentina or some other country where he could conduct a lecture tour. Instead, he was posted to one of 4 new consular positions created by the Dáil in the United States. He arrived in Chicago in August 1920, with the Boston Globe giving him the lofty title of Eamon de Valera's coadjutor. On his arrival, he became witness to the terminal decline in relations between De Valera, who at the time was on a tour of the United States, and the existing Irish-American organizations there, specifically the Friends of Irish Freedom and the Irish Republican Brotherhood's sister organization, Clon na Gael. As De Valera plotted the launch of a new Irish-American organization, Ginnell's role was to enlist the support not only of Irish Americans in the country's vast Midwest, but also radicals and prominent sympathizers from other ethnic and religious backgrounds. One of his primary contacts was the renowned boss of the powerful Chicago Federation of Labor, John Fitzpatrick, who was a native of Athlone in Ginnell's native Westmeath. Under the auspices of Ginnell, Fitzpatrick, and the Canadian-born Irish nationalist J.C. Walsh, a Labour Bureau for Irish Independence was established in Chicago and was vigorously promoted by Ginnell throughout his stay in America. Meanwhile, Ginnell was also part of a delegation which, in October 1920, met with US Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby, and which unsuccessfully sought to convince the Wilson administration to make some gesture acknowledging Terence McSweeney's death on hunger strike. And he also at this time testified before the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland. De Valera's founding of the American Association for the Recognition of an Irish Republic opened up a new potential field of activity for Ginnell, but by the end of 1920, it became clear that his days in America were numbered. In November, Laurence and Alice launched a relief fund out of an office on Chicago's North Dearborn Street to support families who had been affected by British atrocities in Ireland. The initiative was a typical manifestation of Ginnell's independent-mindedness and immediately caused tensions with the Dáil's primary financial agent in the US, James O'Mara, who believed the fund was in conflict with the new association's fundraising initiatives in Illinois. O'Mara won this battle, and to ease the tension between these two heavy hitters, Ginnell was sent on a tour of the southern states of America, namely New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. Here he gave lectures before large crowds, and to his surprise, encountered nativists and evangelical Protestants who were deeply hostile to Irish republicanism and Catholicism. Now, on his return to Chicago, Ginnell's next port of call was already decided. Harry Boland astutely advised De Valera that as Ginnell was a sitting TD for Longford Westmeath, Argentina would be an ideal posting given the strong connections among many Irlandeses to these counties in the Irish Midlands. It was an elegant solution to the ongoing standoff between O'Mara and Ginnell, with the latter fuming at how O'Mara had neglected the Labour Bureau for Irish Independence during Ginnell's tour of the southern states. Now, I won't go into detail about Laurence and Alice Ginnell's time in Argentina, as our forthcoming speakers will more than account for it. But for me, one of the most fascinating aspects of the mission was Ginnell's back and forth joust with the British minister in Buenos Aires, Ronald Maclay. In many respects, Ginnell won this tit-for-tat propaganda war with Maclay, who was easily irritated by his Irish counterpart. Laurence and Alice, of course, opposed the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the centenary of which takes place this December. Ginnell was immediately suspicious of the legal terminology contained within the London Agreement, and as the treaty debates began in Dublin, he cabled his intention to oppose ratification. The advent of the treaty was to him a personal as well as a political disaster. Firstly, it led to the sudden evaporation of his raison d'etre as the envoy in Argentina, not to mention the derailing of the Dáil fundraising campaign he had launched there in October 1921. Secondly, he was under severe pressure from some of his closest lieutenants in Ireland to rethink his opposition to the agreement. Most prominent of these was Alice's family, the Kings. James King, the family patriarch, backed the treaty, and in an early 1922 letter from Alice's sister, in early 1922, a letter from Alice's sister Madeleine reached them in Buenos Aires, urging Laurence to reconsider his stance. However, both husband and wife remained convinced of the correctness of their position, and Ginnell vigorously campaigned against both the treaty and the nascent Irish Free State until his death. Now, the fight briefly appeared to go out of Ginnell when he returned to Ireland, which he correctly interpreted to be on the brink of civil war. He retired to a nursing home in County Wicklow, but briefly emerged to contest the pact election which preceded the outbreak of war in Ireland. In September 1922, with the conflict underway, he was part of a strategy by anti-treaty Republicans to test the legitimacy of the Provisional Parliament in Dublin by presenting himself before that body and protesting the exclusion of TDs from the partitioned 6 counties. Causing a scene, he was removed from the House by the Sergeant at Arms, earning him the unique title of being the only person forcibly ejected from both British and Irish parliaments. Now, for a brief time, and I'll finish with this, Ginnell returned to the world stage when he was chosen by De Valera as a member of his Council of State and then as the anti-treatyite representative in the United States. Ginnell returned to New York in December 1922 with an exhaustive array of instructions and powers afforded to him by De Valera. The sweeping nature of his position and responsibilities, taken to by Ginnell with characteristic gusto, upset the network of anti-treaty representatives already established in America, who were unwilling to have their activities micromanaged. Within days of his arrival, Ginnell's mission was rendered effectively impotent by his failure not only to secure access to Republican funds in US banks, but also his failure to eject the provisional government's representative in Washington, D.C., Dr. Timothy Smithy. Ginnell tried various initiatives to reassert his authority as an envoy during the spring of 1923, but these only served to further deepen his disagreements with his fellow anti-treaty activists in the US. Burdened by the intense pressure of the seemingly impossible task thrust upon his shoulders by De Valera, Laurence Ginnell died at a Washington hotel on the 17th of April, 1923. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my broad but hopefully comprehensive sketch of Ginnell's life and career. There's so much more I could go into, but I'm conscious of time, and not to mention the fact that I'm very much looking forward to hearing our contributions from our other speakers. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was very, very complete and hugely interesting archival material. So we will be looking forward to the volume of the biography, which I know you have in preparation. Thank you very much for that, and we look forward to continuing this. And as you rightly said, you left the piece on the mission to Argentina, and that leads us neatly to now going to give the floor to Dermot to talk on the issue of the mission to Argentina. Dermot.
Thanks, Justin.
Your Excellencies, fellow panelists, Paula, Justin, Veronica, thank you for the invitation to speak here this evening. And I'm very grateful for Paul's lucid presentation, which certainly sets the scene for the remarks that I'm about to make concerning Ginnell's visit and mission to Argentina. So when the radical party leader Hipólito Yrigoyen assumed the office of president of Argentina in 1916, the British ambassador in Buenos Aires, Sir Reginald Tower, made his protocolary visit, during the course of which he was injudicious enough to remind Yrigoyen of what he said was a tradition among all new Argentine presidents. That was, Tower said, to consult the government in London before he picked the members of the new cabinet. According to the historian Norberto Galasso, Yrigoyen replied tartly, "Es un costumbre que el señor embajador debe dar por terminar." This is a custom the ambassador must end. Tower was, as his interview above suggests, an old school diplomat. Regarding Argentina as part of Britain's informal empire, Tower viewed the country as a virtual fifth dominion. Residing in the Plaza Hotel for the duration of his posting, he was, according to his second in command, the Irishman David Kelly, close to the Argentine plutocracy. Kelly, later ambassador to Argentina under Perón, like Tower, viewed Yrigoyen as a demagogue, and here I'm quoting, who was idolized by those who had, quote, an instinct for a popular dictator, unquote, and were in search of a caudillo in the South American tradition, quote, with a mystical rather than a rational appeal. In reality, what British diplomats did not like was Irigoyen's independence in both foreign and domestic policy. As a social reformer, he identified with the poor immigrants and making him very popular among the Irish. And during his early years in power, the economy enjoyed unprecedented growth. He had raised their living standards, regulated working hours, improved factory working conditions, and introduced compulsory pensions and universal access to public education. Irigoyen provided the hundreds of thousands of new Argentines, immigrants from Europe and elsewhere, who had arrived in the previous 40 years with a sense of belonging and security in their adopted country. So when Tower was leaving his post in 1919, Kelly in his memoirs recalled that several hundred people attended a farewell banquet at the Jockey Club, whose main function was, according to Kelly, to act as a political demonstration against Irigoyen. Tower's successor, Sir Ronald Maclay, arrived in Buenos Aires he arrived in Buenos Aires only to depart immediately with his wife to Mar del Plata for a few months' summer holidays. He left behind on his desk in the embassy signed blank sheets of dispatch paper. That was to allow Kelly to submit reports to London under the ambassador's name while he was at the seaside. This easygoing approach to the duties of being a British envoy in Buenos Aires revealed the undemanding and leisurely nature of the posting, which also applied to other British embassies in Latin America. However, the War of Independence in Ireland between 1919 and 22 disturbed the equilibrium of British diplomats in different Latin American countries, most particularly in Argentina, where a large Irish-Argentine community was already politicized and supportive of the Irish struggle for independence. Dáil Éireann in early 19 chose Eamon Bulfin, the son of the journalist and writer William, to be an envoy to Argentina, and also with a wide brief to cover other parts of Latin America. In my book, I describe about Bulfin. He was the son of William Bulfin, part of the garrison in 1916, sentenced to death. His sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, largely because, or it is believed because, his mother made an appeal saying that he was an Argentine citizen. Although he was born in Argentina in 1892, he was not an Argentine citizen until 1917, when the Argentine consul in Dublin gave him an Argentine passport. That unfortunately led to the British deporting him from Liverpool to Argentina, where he arrived in Buenos Aires only to find that he was eligible for military service, and his diplomatic career he had to put on hold until he got out of the Navy in early 1920. In parallel with Bulfin's appeal to Michael Collins and the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Eamon de Valera agreed to send the veteran Irish Republican MP, or Chuck Tidola, member of the Irish Dáil, Laurence Ginnell, to Argentina. As you have heard in an earlier paper, Ginnell had worked closely with de Valera in the United States, or was part of a major group who were working with de Valera in the United States. And his main task in Buenos Aires was to continue that work in his new posting, mainly launch a bond drive identical to what was done so successfully in the US. Besides being given instructions to raise substantial funds for Dáil Éireann, he was charged with the task of improving Irish publicity throughout the region. And besides Argentina, he also had instructions to present his credentials at a later date to the governments of Chile, Brazil, and Bolivia. His credentials, signed by de Valera, named him as a special envoy to the governments and peoples of Latin America. He brought copies in 3 languages, Irish, English, and Spanish. Both Ginnell, who was 69, and his wife Alice would have preferred to return to Ireland, but duty called. They traveled on documents issued by the US consul in New York, and with a visa from the Argentine consulate in the same city. Arriving in Buenos Aires in early July 1921, he was met by Bulfin and Monsignor Usher and Gerald Foley, editor of the Southern Cross. Wearing his trademark black silk top hat and sporting his familiar white beard, Ginnell's patrician appearance resembled more a member of the Jockey Club than that of a dangerous revolutionary. While he showed great enthusiasm for his new assignment, he was in poor health, and it worsened during his short mission, which ended in spring 1922. For reasons of time, I will make the following points to summarize his mission in Argentina. I'll first set out the reasons that limited his success and then outline his substantial contributions, being the second Irish envoy to Argentina from Dáil Éireann. First of all, the timing of his mission was unfortunate. Both Bulfin and Ginnell viewed with skepticism the Anglo-Irish talks taking place in the latter half of 1921 and held out little prospect for their success. In publicly opposing the treaty signed on the 6th of December, Ginnell lost a great degree of support from many prominent Irish Argentines, and I'll return to that point later. Timing again played against Ginnell's success in certain areas. He arrived in Buenos Aires after the Irish Argentines had given generous donations for over a year to the Irish White Cross, money that was sent to Ireland to relieve the sufferings of those affected by violence of the British Crown forces in Ireland. His heavy work rate in his early months in Argentina, dealing with a factionalized Irish Argentine community, undermined his already compromised health. By early December, he was hospitalized for many weeks in the Morgan Hospital in San Antonio de Areco. His failing health was significant reason for his failure to travel to Chile, Brazil, and Bolivia while in Buenos Aires or on his homeward journey. The actions of the British Embassy were another reason why Ginnell failed to accomplish his major objective, that was to launch a successful Irish national bond drive. Ginnell found that the divisions within the Irish community slowed down his work, and that was a recurring problem for him during the months that he was in Buenos Aires. But despite his health, splits in the Irish community, the antagonism of the British Embassy, the timing of the mission regarding fundraising and the treaty split, Ginnell, against all the odds, heightened the profile of Ireland in Argentina. He was an engaging speaker, and he had almost a mythical profile among Irish Argentines from Westmeath and the Midlands, where Ginnell had worked over the decades as an MP and later as a TD, publishing, as the first speaker has referred to, a number of books on a range of topics, which gave him an international profile. During his tour of Irish communities in the camp, Ginnell was accorded a hero's welcome. He really did not have to do or say a great deal, as he had come to South America as part of the Irish Republican inner circle, a friend of Eamon de Valera, known to Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins. That reputation was sufficient to cause the British envoy to be nervous when Ginnell arrived. Ronald Maclay reported his fear to London that Yrigoyen, wishing to consolidate the Irish vote for the presidential election in 1922, might be prepared, in the event of the US recognizing Irish independence, to become the second country to do so. The British envoy also feared, because of the president's wish to hold on to the Irish vote in 1922, that Ginnell would be received by the Argentine Foreign Minister, Honorio Pueyrredón. In such circumstances, Maclay concluded that he would not be surprised if, and I quote, the so-called special envoy of the Irish Republic does not succeed in obtaining a private audience with His Excellency, if possible, not through diplomatic channels, unquote. Maclay's surmise proved to be correct. Ginnell, with very important connections in the Irish community, very powerful connections in the Irish community, was given a private audience with Pueyrredón on the 19th of August, 1921, but the minister refused to accept his credentials when Ginnell proffered them to him. Ginnell was left in no doubt that it was a private visit. However, the fact that both men met was a coup for Ginnell, and the reports of his visit to Pueyrredón were recorded and reported in the Freeman's Journal, and I think in other Irish newspapers. That meeting with Pueyrredón came, according to the British envoy, 2 days after Ginnell had been received at an official reception by all the leading influential Irish Argentines. Maclay reported that Ginnell had been solemnly introduced as the Honorary Laurence Ginnell. Maclay couldn't spell Laurence correctly, the Special Ambassador of the Irish Republic. The British envoy, on instructions from London, lodged an objection to the Foreign Ministry and to Pueyrredón because he had received Ginnell, albeit in a private and unofficial capacity. Ginnell was a good organizer, and despite his poor and declining health, he had received funds to support his mission in Buenos Aires and in Argentina, which enabled him to establish an office in the fashionable Galeria Güemes in Buenos Aires. He had also had funds enough to employ a secretary who acted also as a translator, and to spend money intensifying the publicity campaign by having posters and flyers distributed around Buenos Aires. After a difficult and awkward start, Ginnell established a good working relationship with Anita and Eamon Bulfin. You can imagine the situation where Bulfin had received his credentials, making him envoy in Argentina and also with duties in Latin America, to be faced by yet another person performing a duplicate role. But notwithstanding the difficulties and the awkwardnesses that were evident early on, Ginnell developed a good working relationship with Bulfin. They worked well as a team, and when Patrick J. Little arrived in October 1922 in Buenos Aires, that experienced journalist set down a structure to publish the Irish Bulletin in Spanish for distribution throughout Latin America. Little's brief presence in the country coincided with the publication of the Irish Bond Drive, which went on sale in October. He hired the Teatro Coliseo, which is a large theatre, for the 29th of October 1921. However, divisions within the Irish community surfaced in a very public way prior to the meeting being held. The advertising publicising the event caused offence to a number of leading Irish Argentines, and John Nelson, one of the most prominent and one of the strongest supporters of the Irish struggle for independence, refused to take the chair on the occasion at the meeting on the 29th of October. He called the poster advertising the meeting socialist propaganda. And that was also the comment of others, including a prominent Irish priest who had booked a box in the Colosseo and had returned the tickets and demanded his money back. In the midst of the faltering bond drive, Ginnell had a major success. On the 29th of November 1921, he held what he described as the first convention of Irish people and their descendants ever held in Latin America. Some 50 delegates attended, and William Morgan, another prominent Irish Argentine, took the chair. A standing committee was appointed and delegates were selected to represent Argentina at the Irish Race Conference in Paris in January 1922. As it happened, the people who were selected to go to Paris were already going to Europe, and they just doubled up as delegates to that convention. When news arrived on the 8th of December that De Valera had rejected the treaty, signed 2 days earlier in London, the Ginnells and the Bulfins immediately took his side. That night, a dinner was held to say goodbye to Little, who was leaving for home on the 10th. Confusion reigned among Irish Argentines. John Nelson sent a telegram of congratulations to Dublin, and on reading the terms of the treaty, withdrew his support. Ginnell, at a prize giving in St. Paul's school at Capitan Sarmiento, pledged his support for De Valera. Ginnell cabled De Valera as a member of the Dáil, "I vote against ratification." On the 20th of January 1922, Ginnell published a full explanation for his stance. He told his superiors in Dublin that once it had become known that the treaty had been signed, no Irish Republican bond could be sold, as the Republic was universally regarded as at an end, unquote. The bond drive had raised 19,166 pesos, and expenditure in setting it up cost 11,282 pesos. At the meeting, the subscribers were given the option to receive a check if their bonds were returned by the 5th of April 1922. In other words, the bond drive was run at a loss. Broken in spirit and in health, Ginnell returned to Ireland, as the first speaker has said, just before the outbreak of the Civil War. Well, a few months before the outbreak of the Civil War. He had closed the mission office in Buenos Aires and paid off the staff. He spent time in hospital in Limerick, being nursed by the Blue Sisters, who had also nursed him in San Antonio de Areco in the Morgan Hospital there. And on the 9th of September, he was escorted from the Dáil, as has been said, for refusing to sign the roll. Sent by De Valera to the US, he died on the 17th of April 1923, alone in a hotel room in Washington. Bulfin returned to Ireland, having ended the mission and sold off the furniture, returned to Ireland later, but played no further part in politics. Anita, his sister, died in the early 1930s. Ginnell's widow was visited in 1932 by an Argentine delegation which was attending the Eucharistic Congress, and they traveled to Ginnell's grave, laid a wreath and an Argentine flag on it, and then visited Mrs. Ginnell. So in conclusion, the Bulfin-Ginnell missions to Argentina were landmarks in Irish-Argentine relations. Their actions ought to be included in the new historical narratives appearing at this time and in the work of historians in the coming years. I think it would be fitting to put a plaque in Buenos Aires to commemorate the endeavors of Eamon and Anita Bulfin, Alice and Laurence Ginnell. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dermot, and that very intriguing idea of a plaque in Buenos Aires. Perhaps I walked by the Galeria Westmeath the other day, and I was thinking of the office, the Irish office there in 1921, and your description of the divisions within the Irish Argentine community at the time, I think, are very telling, and obviously had an enormous impact on him personally and on the success of his mission. Thank you very much for that. We'll come back, I'm sure, to the content. And now I'd like to ask Anne-Marie if she would like to take the floor. Anne-Marie, please.
Thank you, Justin. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that? Yes?
Yes,
yeah.
Indeed, we can see, yeah.
Great, thank you. Good evening, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I now have the very unenviable task of following Paul and Dermot, so I hope there's not too much overlap in what I'm going to be speaking about today. I should also preface this by saying that I have a dog lying next to me who is snoring, so I'm very sorry if you can hear that. So I've spoken at a number of these centenary events over the past number of years, and as my research focuses on highlighting women's contribution to Irish diplomacy in this period. And thanks to Dermot and Paul's and others' work, the Irish-Argentine relationship in this period has become a better known aspect of Irish diplomatic history. But the contributions of the two women who were central to the Argentine mission has remained obscure. So the two women I will focus on this evening are Laurence Ginnell, wife of Laurence, and Anita Bulfin, the sister of Irish representative to Argentina, Eamon Bulfin. And while some of you may know or have heard of these women because of their association with their male relatives, I will focus on their role in Argentina and how they contributed to the diplomatic mission. So I just want to give you a very brief overview of their backgrounds and how they came to be in Argentina in 1921. So Laurence Ginnell, née King, was born in Mullingar, County Westmeath in 1882 to James King, the first vice chairman of Westmeath County Council, and his wife Georgina. On the 30th of January 1902, she married Laurence Ginnell, and as Paul said, he was 30 years her senior. The couple were active in the Irish Republican movement, particularly after the 1916 Easter Rising, when Laurence moved his political allegiances from the Irish Parliamentary Party to Sinn Féin. In the aftermath of 1916, while living in London, Laurence Ginnell visited female Republican prisoners in Lewis, Aylesbury, Wandsworth, and Woking jails under the pseudonym of Mrs. Jones. In 1917, the Ginnells returned to Ireland and Alice became more immersed in the Republican movement. She was a member of Cum Naman and Sinn Féin, and in 1917, she was elected Secretary of Cum Na Teachtair, or the League of Women Delegates. She was subsequently elected to the Sinn Féin executive alongside other Republican women, Kathleen Clark, Anya Ciant, Jenny Wise-Power, Kathleen Lynn, and Helena Maloney. The following year, she acted as her husband's election agent, and Laurence was successfully elected Sinn Féin TD for County Westmeath, and he was subsequently appointed Director for Publicity in the First Dáil. In July 1920, Alice accompanied her husband to Chicago, where he established the Irish Relief and Reconstruction Fund and distributed the Irish Bulletin. 12 months later, the Ginnells set sail for Argentina to commence a speaking tour of Latin America. Less is known about Anita Bulfin's background. She was the daughter of William Bulfin, a native of County Offaly, who spent most of his adult life in Argentina after emigrating in 1884. He subsequently became owner and editor of the newspaper The Southern Cross and was well known in Argentina as a writer and journalist. In 1891, he married Anne O'Rourke, a native of County Westmeath, and they had one son, Eamon, and 4 daughters: Caitlin, also known as Catalina or Kit, Mary, Eileen, and Anita. The family returned to Ireland in 1911, and similar to the Ginnells, the Bulfins were active in the Republican movement. As Professor Keogh said, Eamon participated in the Easter Rising. He was arrested and deported to Argentina upon his parole in 1917. He was subsequently confirmed as Irish representative to Argentina by Eamon de Valera, and Anita, who had returned to Argentina by this time for health reasons, remained in the country and assisted him. The circumstances around both women's presence in Argentina in 1921 then is centred on the activities of Laurence Ginnell and Eamon Bulfin. However, both women carved independent roles for themselves as unofficial representatives of the Irish Republic. Sorry, I'll just move slide. The Ginnells arrived in Argentina on the 25th of July 1921. Eamon Bulfin had maintained contacts with his father's former newspaper, the Southern Cross, and it ran a review of Laurence Ginnell's Republican credentials upon his arrival, concluding that it was an honour for all of us to have such an outstanding representative among us. Almost immediately after his arrival, Laurence Ginnell was invited to Te Deum in celebration of Peruvian independence. And within a month of their arrival, the Ginnells were invited to public functions with important Irish Argentinians, received by the Passionists, an Irish missionary in Argentina, and Laurence obtained a private meeting with the Argentinian Foreign Minister, Peridon. It is clear that there was much interest in Ginnell's arrival in Argentina, and at the age of 69 and with a history of ill health, Alice assumed the responsibility of managing her husband's engagements. She gave and attended receptions with prominent Irish Argentinians and state officials and fostered contacts with the Irish religious communities in Buenos Aires. Laurence Ginnell's tempestuous and forthright nature was well known in Irish political circles. And while his sincerity for Irish independence was never questioned, his authoritative personality was sometimes at odds with Argentinian journalists. Eamon Bulfin reported on the 4th of August that La Nación newspaper had reserved 2 columns for LG, but that he, LG, was a little indiscreet in calling Lloyd George two-faced, and of course they could not publish that. So after this event, Alice assumed a more forthright responsibility managing the press, and she spoke to journalists about her husband's role in South America. Indeed, there was great interest in the proposed meeting between Laurence and Foreign Minister Peridon, and Alice recalled in her Bureau of Military History witness statement that she met with a journalist from the Associated Press. He confirmed that he was writing that Laurence insisted on being received by Peridon, either privately or officially. And, quote, after a great tussle with him, Mrs. G got him to omit the part about LG's insistence on his reception. So it's clear then that Alice Ginnell was carving an image for her husband in Argentina as an official representative of the Irish Republic, seeking a dignified and respectful diplomatic courtesy from Argentinian officials. The unofficial and private meeting occurred on the 18th of August, and although Peridon refused to recognise the Irish Republic, it was a, quote, friendly and courteous meeting. In September 1921, the Irish delegation in Buenos Aires received permission from Dáil Éireann to launch the Republican bond drive for £500,000. In the same month, Irish representative in South Africa, Patrick J. Little, arrived in Argentina. His arrival in conjunction with the establishment of the bond drive resulted in more fervent activity on behalf of the Irish delegation. Little established the Irish Bulletin in Argentina, increasing the Irish delegation's visibility and propaganda efforts. In a report to Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, Robert Brennan, Little revealed that Eamon Bulfin and Alice Ginnell, quote, urged me to help at propaganda and organisation, unquote, and the Irish Bulletin was the result of this. Despite Bulfin's connections with the Southern Cross newspaper, he nor Ginnell had the sufficient resources to publish the bulletin. With Little's endorsement, it was approved by the Dáil in October and £1,000 was cabled. Little revealed that, quote, no one here of those really reliable was familiar with journalism, unquote. However, it does appear that Anita Bulfin had inherited her father's journalistic skills, and Little declared that she, quote, has the time and has the right ideas, and something of the family gifts for clear writing, unquote. Her fluency in Spanish was also a clear advantage when publishing the weekly bulletin. An examination of the activities of Alice and Anita revealed that they did not work closely together. Alice was occupied with organising her husband's engagements and remaining in touch with prominent Irish Argentinians, while Anita provided administrative and journalistic skills to the delegation. However, the witness statements of both Patrick J. Little and Alice Ginnell show that Anita also accompanied the delegation to social engagements and visits to other cities and towns because of her linguistic ability. In October 1921, the delegation visited the city of Rosario. Ginnell recalls that there was a great banner of the Argentine Committee for Irish Liberty facing us at the station, and a great crowd of all kinds to meet us. A little girl presented Mrs. G with a lovely bouquet of flowers. It was interesting and amazing to watch the faces of the people on the sidewalks and in the houses, wondering what on earth it was all about. Miss Bulfin said she felt like a Salvation lass. After a while, we noticed that we had mounted police and several carriages in procession. So these recollections clearly demonstrate the popularity of the Ginnells and support for Irish independence. That evening, a banquet was held for Laurence Ginnell, at which the Vice-Governor, Mayor, and a representative of the Chief of Police were present. There were just 4 women at this event, including Alice Ginnell and Anita Bulfin. Ginnell stated that because she could speak Spanish, Miss Bulfin sat beside the Vice-Governor. At first, he was a very difficult proposition because he felt that he should not have come. Miss Bulfin said afterwards, "I think if I succeeded in making him talk, I could make anyone talk." So Bulfin's linguistic skills were of clear importance at these social engagements in explaining Ireland's case for independence. The Irish delegation, and particularly the Ginnells, continued this form of public diplomacy throughout their mission in Argentina. The Catholic Church proved to be a great supporter of Irish independence, and on the 2nd of November, masses were held throughout Argentina for those who had died for Ireland. The Ginnells attended a solemn requiem mass in the Holy Cross, which was described as follows. The altar was beautiful and there was a coffin draped with the Republican colours. Father O'Connell preached a very useful sermon, which ought to have some effect on the weak-kneed. As well as religious connections, the Ginnells entertained and lobbied the Irish Argentine community. A reception was hosted in the Savoy Hotel, public bond drive meetings were held, hurling matches were attended, Irish plays were staged, and the first convention of the Irish race was held on the 29th of November. The level of entertaining did take its toll on Laurence Ginnell's health, and the couple retired to San Antonio de Orejo for recuperation. The seriousness of his health condition is revealed by Alice Ginnell when she admitted, quote, "Sometimes I wonder how long more LG can last," unquote. While in convalescence, the news was announced that the Anglo-Irish Treaty had been signed. The couple were in opposition to it, as has been alluded to by Professor Keogh. Alice declared on the 8th of December, "The more I think of these terms, the more I dislike them, and that it would now be time for LG to withdraw from public life, or at any rate not to take the oath of the King." Throughout January 1922, Laurence's health continued to decline, and on the 21st of January, Alice cabled de Valera stating that they wished to return home. The Ginnells returned home to Ireland in April 1922, ending their mission in Argentina. Despite his declining health, Laurence ran as an anti-treaty candidate in the general election of 1922, and Alice became his election agent for a second time. In October 1922, Alice returned to the US under her maiden name Alice King, working for anti-treaty Republicans. She established a public stenographer office on Madison Avenue, New York, and Laurence followed in December and became the anti-treaty representative in Washington at the request of de Valera. Just 4 months later, Laurence died suddenly on the 17th of April 1923. The news was broken to Alice by Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, who was in the US at this time. Eamon and Anita Bulfin also opposed the Anglo-Irish Treaty. While Eamon resigned from his position in Argentina and returned to Ireland in July 1922, though he did not take an active part in the ensuing civil war, Anita died of tuberculosis in 1923. And Professor Keogh has assessed that had she lived, she could have played a very important role in the formation of the Irish state during or after the Civil War, a statement I would tend to agree with. The success of Anita Bulfin's role in Argentina lies in her linguistic and journalistic skills. Patrick J. Little described the huge task of publishing propaganda in Argentina. He wrote, "This bulletin is praised now because it follows the judicial style of statement of the home one. Everybody helps to get out the bulletin. It's a big job, 600 copies." Bulfin was responsible for this weekly Irish bulletin, in addition to a fortnightly sheet, all published in Spanish. She also proved to be indispensable during public engagements, translating for the delegation and publicising Dáil Éireann's message that Ireland was an independent republic. Alice Ginnell's role was very different, and her success lies in her public diplomacy skills. Jan Mellison has stated that in the context of public diplomacy, governments realise that developing their country's overseas attractiveness requires reaching out to transnational civil society. Now, I'm not arguing that Ginnell viewed her position in these terms, but it is evident that she crafted an image for her and her husband, and therefore the Irish Republic, through public engagement and contact with the wider Irish-Argentine community. Indeed, the couple's diplomatic manoeuvrings were successful, and she viewed herself as part of a diplomatic team, recalling the couple's activities in the plural, we and us. Furthermore, her witness statements support the argument that as a diplomatic spouse, she valued her role abroad as a representative of the Irish Republic. And this is a theme which runs through many of the records of other Irish diplomatic spouses abroad in this period. Like many women in this period, both Ginnell and Bulfin provided support, as well as language, administrative and public affairs skills. And it is undeniable that the Irish diplomatic mission in Argentina benefited from the presence of Alice Ginnell and Anita Bulfin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. That was enormously interesting, the transformative roles played by both Alice and by Anita. And some of the detail there, I must say, was very new to me. Many thanks for that. Ok, voy a cambiar al castellano y vamos a seguir ahora para hablar un poco del contexto político en Argentina en ese momento. Así que doy la palabra primero a Roberto Elizalde y después a Diego Barbero. Pero Roberto, tienes la palabra. Si estás con nosotros, Roberto.
Señoras embajadoras, presidente de la asociación, amigos, colegas. La historia de las relaciones exteriores es un tema aún pendiente en el estudio de nuestro pasado, especialmente ligándolo con esa vida cotidiana que nos permite conocer algunos aspectos muy interesantes. Al promediar la década del 60, el ex canciller Miguel Ángel Cárcano comenzó a escribir su libro La política internacional en la historia argentina, que llegó hasta el año 1830 y vio la luz en 4 volúmenes en 1972. Abundaban apuntes, pero lamentablemente quedó allí trunca porque el autor murió en mayo de 1978. En la introducción comentaba que comenzó a escribir dicha obra cuando apenas se atisbaban entre nosotros los signos de violencia que alcanzaron su máxima aspiración en los últimos tiempos. Testigo de las convulsiones de su época, evocaba la de los primeros años de la patria, y no pretendía establecer inexistentes similitudes, pero sí para que de su confrontación surja el contraste capaz de realzar la magnitud de los valores que antaño intervinieron. Hoy venimos a evocar el centenario de la llegada de Laurence Ginnell, pero vamos a narrar un poco el tiempo político, que seguramente con mucha más autoridad lo va a hacer nuestro querido amigo y colega Diego Barbero, presidente del Instituto Irigoyeniano, Instituto Nacional Irigoyeniano, con quien no es la primera vez que salimos en dupla a hacer alguna de estas conversaciones sobre esos tiempos. El 12 de octubre de 1916 asumió el gobierno Hipólito Yrigoyen. La ley Sáenz Peña combatida por algunos de sus propios partidarios, permitió una renovación necesaria en el proceso electoral con el voto secreto, llevando al radicalismo a gobernar hasta la revolución del 6 de septiembre de 1930. La política exterior de don Hipólito se enfrentó con el grave problema de la guerra, con sus consecuencias en todo sentido. Le preocupaba la relación con todos los países, muy especialmente también con los americanos, porque no podemos omitir el lugar de privilegio en el que estaba la Argentina en esos tiempos y también sus necesidades económicas, como surge siempre. El embajador Juan Archibaldo Lanús afirma algo que resulta muy importante destacar. La primera constatación es la clara diferencia que existía entre gobierno y administración. Había un concepto de Estado cuya continuidad no estaba influenciado por los vaivenes de la política y la jerarquía de los funcionarios, era respetada por los ministros, cuyo único subsecretario era casi siempre un diplomático profesional. Pasan las administraciones y vemos opinar siempre al mismo consejero legal, cuya autoridad intelectual nadie osaba contestar. La Cancillería no era un objeto apto para el abordaje partidario y su administración sencilla conoció cambiantes cúpulas de amigos y socios que llegaban con cada ministro. Otra constatación es que los cambios de presidente no implicaban modificaciones a nuestras legaciones en el exterior. No era fácil la situación del gobierno cuando llega acá a Buenos Aires el enviado. Ya un par de años atrás, Tower, que durante su gestión en Argentina representando al Reino Unido, se había ocupado con gran dedicación de los intereses británicos y sobre todo de las cuestiones que afectaban al comercio, en un despacho a Londres mostraba cierta desconfianza con Irigoyen. Los actos del presidente no corresponden con sus palabras y la presente fase de malestar laboral me hace temer por el futuro inmediato del capital británico en la República Argentina. Irigoyen tuvo dos ministros de Relaciones Exteriores. Carlos Becú, que renunció a fines de enero de 1917, siendo ocupada interinamente la cartera por Honorio Pueyrredón, que lo era de Agricultura y Ganadería. Acá hay un detalle a tener en cuenta que muy bien lo narra José F. Sibori en un pequeño libro dedicado al canciller. Aceptado el Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores, Pueyrredón destaca su alta jerarquía moral. Ante el pedido del presidente para que todos sus colaboradores se despojasen de sus actividades privadas, retira la chapa de abogado de su estudio y se aleja de toda actividad particular. Prefiere consagrarse a los intereses de la nación. No será padrino de nadie en sus tramitaciones en el gobierno como nunca lo fue. Aplica de esta manera la ética en la función pública. No era Pueyrredón igual a esos hombres prácticos o realistas que trabajan para su bolsillo, como decía Lem, o por lo menos de algunos que bien sabemos que eran abogados de las compañías inglesas del ferrocarril o que tenían que ver todavía con la célebre deuda de la Marine Brothers y que ocupaban alguna vez algún cargo ministerial, o por lo menos los atendían desde su estudio. Esto es importante porque generalmente muchos de los funcionarios de algunos gobiernos lo habían sido, especialmente con empresas de origen británico, llámense frigoríficos, ferrocarriles, administraciones rurales o fábricas que tenían acá sus representantes, en muchos casos de productos agropecuarios. La misión que también estudió Dermot, debemos agregar algunos datos que hemos encontrado no menores en tiempos de pandemia, donde no hemos podido ver el contexto de toda la información que hay a través de los diarios. En primer lugar, hay que hacer un detalle muy interesante sobre lo que eran los diarios y la comunicación en aquella época, sobre todo para los más jóvenes que nos están escuchando. Uno leía un diario y se enteraba de lo que pasaba en cualquier pueblo del país. Siempre había una noticia, o sea, todo estaba relacionado y era un foco de opinión no menor. Y después de los diarios había algunas revistas. Y la revista más importante era la revista Caras y Caretas, cuya trascendencia como locales solo nosotros quizás la podemos interpretar cabalmente, porque traía noticias de los territorios, que no solo eran el Chaco, Formosa, sino también de toda la Patagonia. Traía noticias de Uruguay, de España, de Marruecos, de Asunción del Paraguay, de Montevideo, de Chile. O sea, él no tenía una gran difusión. Ya empezamos a buscar qué había en esa revista sobre Irlanda, como sería muy interesante buscarla en los el famoso diario socialista La Vanguardia, para poner un ejemplo, o en alguna otra publicación, como el diario de los Laines. Hay varios datos interesantes. Por ejemplo, la concurrencia, una foto de la concurrencia, una misa celebrada pro Irlanda en julio de 1921, justamente en el momento en que llegaba el enviado, en la parroquia de la Inmaculada Concepción de Lincoln. Entre el público se observa la presencia de Monseñor Agustín Piaggio, que era capellán de la fragata Sarmiento y autor de numerosos libros de historia, lo que nos revela la calidad del celebrante, que además era un destacado orador sagrado, como lo consigna al pie de la fotografía que pueden estar viendo en este momento. Eso ya nos revela una propaganda de algún modo o una presencia de la colectividad en los medios. Las memorias del cardenal Santiago Luis Copelo, obispo auxiliar de La Plata, en la época en que nos referimos, luego arzobispo de Buenos Aires y primer cardenal sudamericano en integrar el Sacro Colegio, que falleció siendo canciller de la Santa Iglesia Romana, nos brinda algún dato interesante. Recuerda que el 9 de agosto estaba en San Pedro, donde hizo la visita canónica y administró los sacramentos, especialmente la confirmación, tarea solo reservada a los obispos. A 9 leguas y media, dice, está la capilla del famoso capellán irlandés, el padre Flannery, junto a la población de Santa Lucía, a donde se trasladó en el auto del médico Nochetti 2 días después, y agrega esto: ¿cómo no tener un recuerdo agradecido para los beneméritos capellanes irlandeses ya desaparecidos, que tanto bien hicieron en la campaña de la provincia de Buenos Aires? A quienes, además del ministerio, junto con otros sacerdotes europeos, les debía la construcción de muchos templos. Este dato confirma lo que dice Dermot sobre la famosa homilía de Monseñor Copelo, que la repite en septiembre de 1921, y que además es un prelado muy importante porque después es el vicario general de la arquidiócesis de Buenos Aires, está haciendo una gran carrera, después seguirá como obispo auxiliar de La Plata y finalmente como arzobispo de Buenos Aires, pero era un hombre, lógicamente, que estaba en una gran carrera eclesiástica y no duda en tener estos comentarios. El otro detalle interesante que encontramos es la celebración del Día de la Reconquista. La Reconquista de Buenos Aires era un día que se celebró en los años siguientes al 12 de agosto de 1806. Después cayó un poco en el olvido, aunque siempre se tenía en cuenta la fecha, hasta que en 1892 se organiza, 93, por ahí, un grupo de gente encabezado por el doctor de Nevares, lo llevan al general Mitre, que no podía faltar en ninguna cosa, que era el gran historiador de la patria, y el padre Modesto Beco, que era un sacerdote dominicano, deciden crear una comisión de homenaje y monumento a los héroes de la Reconquista y defensa de Buenos Aires. Y todos los años empieza a nacer el Te Deum en la iglesia de Santo Domingo. A tal importancia cobró que los presidentes concurrían, y el presidente que infaltablemente concurría a ese Te Deum era Hipólito Yrigoyen. Ahí se guardan además en el camarín los trofeos que se tomaron en aquellas jornadas. La foto publicada por Caras y Caretas lo muestra el presidente al abandonar el templo. Está tomada en el atrio, y entre esos caballeros se encuentra el enviado inglés, porque lo dicen los diarios, el irlandés, lo dicen los diarios, lo cual es muy importante porque revela que si bien no estaba recibido oficialmente, se podían establecer contactos sociales o por lo menos en actos demasiado o muy protocolares como correspondía. Y acá viene lo interesante. Yrigoyen era el invitado, que por su investidura lógicamente presidía la ceremonia, y el representante irlandés estaba allí. Y la única bandera extranjera que adornaba el templo junto a las argentinas era la bandera de Irlanda. Un detalle muy curioso también que lo trae esta nota. La revista también nos muestra una foto de una recepción que un grupo de damas le ofreció en el Plaza Hotel, el hotel más importante de Buenos Aires en ese momento, los que nos permitimos rectificar. Se trata de la recepción oficial que se le hizo el 11 de agosto a la colectividad, y en la foto, como gentileza, solo figuran un grupo de señoras, no se han puesto todos los caballeros ni otros. Los medios locales no eran muy proclives a brindar demasiada información sobre el enviado. Todo ello se debe entender, como se lo dijo ya varias veces, el contexto económico. Pero Caras y Caretas publicó una nota sobre el presidente de Valera, donde no titubeó en afirmar: de pronto, en diciembre de 1920, reaparece con sorpresa en Dublín. Las autoridades inglesas negaron por mucho tiempo la noticia del misterioso desembarco. El 5 de mayo de 1921 se entrevistó en Dublín con el jefe de los ulsterianos, sin que de ello resultara acuerdo alguno. Descubierto por la policía inglesa, de Valera fue preso, pero el gobierno inglés, con muy buen criterio, ordenó su libertad inmediata. Fueron momentos difíciles sin duda para el enviado, pero la simpatía para con la causa de Irlanda por el presidente Irigoyen, aunque no de manera manifiesta, se deduce también en las palabras del canciller Pueyrredón, que lo recibió privadamente y que definen la política internacional de Irigoyen, según el mismo testimonio del ministro. He sido su colaborador y su testigo, y puedo suscribir efectivamente que el presidente argentino, del que me honro en ser más que su ministro, su admirador y amigo, tiene un concepto de patria acaso distinto a la generalidad de nuestros hombres. Entiende que es tanto más grande el patriotismo cuanto más amplias son las fronteras y los horizontes en que se encausa. Considera que no debe limitarse ese sentir al amor estrecho y apretado del terruño, sino que por el contrario, los pueblos como los hombres son tanto más fuertes cuanto más grande es el número de sus amigos y cuanto más generoso es el vínculo que les une a los demás pueblos y a los demás hombres. Esa es la política que el presidente Irigoyen ha seguido en el orden internacional y que yo me he honrado y honraré en ser el más modesto, pero el más firme ejecutor. O sea, eso ya revela algo muy interesante a lo que estábamos hablando. Y por otro lado también, en la revista Caras y Caretas, encontramos una noticia publicada el 17 de diciembre de 1921, ya en el cuerpo donde está el número de edición, donde figura su fundador, director, donde dice: Irlanda obtiene su libertad. O sea que la revista Caras y Caretas fue en ese momento un órgano por el cual hubo muchísima difusión. Y repito, muchísima difusión, porque además era una revista que por las fotos, por todo lo que traía, era de lectura en todos los hogares, del jefe de la familia hasta los adolescentes, e incluso los niños podían leer porque había hasta algunas cosas dedicadas para ellos. Así que eso es un poco lo que les puedo aportar en esto que se refiere al centenario. Muchísimas gracias por la atención.
Muchísimas gracias, Roberto. Muy interesantes las fotos y los artículos publicados en Caras y Caretas, la diplomacia pública del momento, quizás el rol de la misión en ese contexto. También tenemos a Diego Barbero. Diego, por favor, perdóname la demora, pero sería muy interesante para nosotros oír de tu perspectiva como presidente del Instituto Irigoyen. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Justin, y agradecido y realmente conmovido por esta invitación. Gracias a los organizadores. Respetos y saludos a las señoras embajadoras, a todos los prestigiosos integrantes de este panel tan singular, tan profundo, que hemos podido participar, escuchar cosas realmente extraordinarias. A mí me toca simplemente hacer un contexto de lo que era ese momento de la Argentina en el que se desarrolla la misión Ginnell. En gran medida me han solucionado y han hecho mi trabajo porque por ejemplo, el profesor Dermot, con mi querido amigo Roberto, han hecho una introducción magnífica que me releva de tener que de ser más preciso, pero me parece que hay algunas generalidades que podría aportar para la concurrencia y que tienen que ver con el contexto local de ese singular momento de la Argentina, que no es ajeno al contexto mundial altamente influenciado por la situación producida a raíz del conflicto mundial, que ha finalizado hacía muy poquito tiempo, con consecuencias realmente notables, y que particularmente en el contexto económico también de la Argentina había dejado un condicionamiento muy profundo a la vida económica. El profesor Dermot hizo referencia a una famosa anécdota por la cual el presidente Irigoyen le hizo esa advertencia al embajador de Su Majestad Británica en el sentido que debía dejar de lado esa tradición que tenían por canónica los representantes del gobierno inglés, de que los gobiernos argentinos antes de asumir ponían bajo su consulta la designación del gabinete de ministros del presidente de la República, situación que el presidente Irigoyen fue muy claro al expresársela, pero que también explica de alguna manera la visión que tenía el presidente Irigoyen con respecto a la dignidad de la República, la dignidad nacional en el contexto del mundo, algo en lo que estuvo particularmente empeñado la gestión del presidente Irigoyen. Sabemos que ya para 1921 Irigoyen ya estaba consolidado, el radicalismo había triunfado en las elecciones de 1916, como señaló el profesor Elizalde, en las que por primera vez se aplicó el sistema de voto universal secreto y obligatorio, conformando, podríamos decir, ya una democracia constitucional orgánica en la República Argentina, la primera experiencia auténticamente democrática para la organización del Estado, concretando lo que establecía el principio republicano del artículo 1 de la Constitución Nacional, y el presidente Irigoyen, una vez establecido en el poder, fue sorteando dificultades, inconvenientes que se le fueron planteando como consecuencia de la realidad cotidiana, de los problemas de la coyuntura, fundamentalmente lo que estaba relacionado con la economía, y como señaló perfectamente en la introducción el amigo Justin, había una notoria y fundamental dependencia de la economía argentina de la economía británica, que era el principal mercado de los productos argentinos. Eso también condiciona las relaciones exteriores que, sin embargo, el presidente Irigoyen a lo largo de todo su mandato, y que tendría continuidad en la presidencia del doctor Alvear, que lo sucede en 1922, y en la segunda presidencia de Irigoyen, que se iniciará en 1928, estuvo presidido por un concepto altamente nacional, que estaba muy basado también en uno de los más notables principios que orientaron su acción internacional, y que entiendo que también han tenido una profunda influencia en la visión de simpatía con la que Irigoyen y Pueyrredón vieron la misión Ginnell y veían la causa irlandesa, que es el sentido de la autodeterminación de los pueblos, uno de los principios fundacionales de la doctrina internacional de Hipólito Yrigoyen y del radicalismo en general. Hay que tener en cuenta que al finalizar la Primera Guerra Mundial, Hipólito Yrigoyen impartió instrucciones a la delegación argentina que presidía precisamente en Suiza, en la Sociedad de Naciones, el canciller Pueyrredón, indicándoles que si no había un pie de igualdad entre los estados beligerantes triunfadores de la contienda mundial y aquellos estados que habían sufrido la derrota, que si no había un pie de igualdad, la delegación argentina debía retirarse, cosa que efectivamente sucedió, y que eso también le brindó al presidente Yrigoyen en el marco internacional un grado de respeto y consideración del que no hace falta más que repasar las publicaciones de la época y analizar también los numerosos trabajos en materia internacional sobre sobre ese periodo se han efectuado para darse cuenta que la figura de Irigoyen le había dado a la Argentina un prestigio mundial del cual vivió durante muchos años. Pudo disfrutarlo la Argentina, esa consideración de respeto a nivel mundial. En ese contexto, el presidente Irigoyen tuvo también, de alguna manera, una simpatía por la causa irlandesa en aquello que tiene que ver con el republicanismo. Hay que tener en cuenta fundamentalmente que Irigoyen llegó a ser presidente de la República 25 años después de que fuera fundado su partido. Hay un cuarto de siglo de luchas del radicalismo que se materializa en sendas revoluciones armadas, revoluciones cívico-militares que se desarrollaron fundamentalmente entre 1893 y 1905, y como consecuencia de las cuales se arribó finalmente a la conocida ley Sáenz Peña, que es la que estableció el régimen democrático de legitimidad de los gobiernos a partir del principio de la soberanía popular. Quiere decir que había algunos puntos ideológicos y doctrinarios de contacto entre esa visión republicana que el profesor Paul nos hizo el resumen magnífico de su primera introducción, y la vieja causa del radicalismo que representaba Irigoyen en el gobierno y que en materia internacional conceptualizó de manera extraordinaria la figura de ese canciller brillante que fue Honorio Porredón, que fue su segundo ministro de Relaciones Exteriores, como contaba recién Roberto Elizalde, que además descendía por línea directa del director supremo de las Provincias Unidas del Río de la Plata, que había apoyado la causa independentista de estas tierras, que había apoyado la causa de emancipación americana, el cruce de los Andes del general San Martín. Estamos hablando que hay un emparentamiento, casi diríamos de tono filial, de figuras que están relacionadas con la independencia nacional y con ese espíritu que nutrió el surgimiento del radicalismo y de su causa democrática a fines del siglo XIX y a principios del siglo XX, momento en el cual recibir la visita del representante Ginnell también tenía que ver con una visión del mundo, de cómo debía ser el mundo en ese momento, privilegiando las relaciones internacionales fundamentalmente basadas en el respeto a la autodeterminación de los pueblos, a la igualdad de los estados, que fueron las posturas de la República Argentina en todos los foros internacionales, pero que fueron fortalecidos especialmente durante la presidencia del presidente Irigoyen. Entonces, creo que eso nos ayuda a entender también la visión, de alguna manera, desde lo doctrinario, desde la formación filosófica que tenía el presidente Irigoyen, de un alto contenido humanista, y la simpatía que, aunque con la prudencia que requerían el caso, por tratarse además de un país que dependía, la Argentina, económicamente tanto de la economía británica, de todas maneras se le brindó a la misión irlandesa el contexto para que pudiese fructificar, porque había además una simpatía política que también anidaba en la simpatía social con la que gran parte del pueblo argentino veía y animaba la causa de la justicia, de la causa irlandesa. Muchas gracias por la invitación y quedo a disposición de ustedes.
Muchísimas gracias, Diego. Eso, para terminar, una descripción muy equilibrada de la situación enfrentada por Ginnell al llegar. De un lado, el humanismo y la perspectiva que tenía Irigoyen y una simpatía por la causa irlandesa, pero del otro lado la situación económica y una perspectiva, digamos, pragmática de la situación que obtenía. Fue un momento complicado, obviamente, para Ginnell. Y claro, bueno, son casi las 11 menos 5 de la noche en Irlanda, así que soy consciente de que hay un límite. Hemos estado realmente hablando durante casi 2 horas, pero las intervenciones realmente de enorme interés. Les agradezco a todos. Creo que en este momento es un poco tarde para entrar en una discusión, una charla con preguntas, así que mi idea es decir simplemente gracias a todos. Esta ponencia van a estar en la grabación que vamos a poner ahora en YouTube. Estamos, claro, en Irlanda, obviamente hay mucha gente que no han podido asistir por la hora, pero van a mirar mañana. Así que quería agradecer de nuevo a todos y paso la palabra a Verónica Repetti de la asociación. Verónica, por favor.
Muchas gracias, Justin. Gracias nuevamente a los destacados especialistas que nos acompañaron hoy. Agradecemos muy especialmente también la presencia del público que nos acompañó. Y simplemente, muy brevemente, queríamos contarles que nuestro próximo evento será el 16 de septiembre y tratará sobre la presencia de irlandeses en Uruguay, Paraguay y Perú. Si ya desean inscribirse, pueden hacerlo en el link que vamos a estar copiando ahora en el chat. Y por último, decirles que los invitamos también a visitar el sitio web de AACE, de nuestra asociación, y a seguir nuestras redes sociales, donde publicaremos más información sobre nuestros próximos eventos y este ciclo de charlas mensuales. Así que bueno, muchísimas gracias. Buenas noches en Irlanda y buenas tardes, noches en Argentina para todos y todas. Gracias.
Un gusto, ¿eh? Hasta luego. Bueno, y un detalle, Pueyrredón era tataranieto de un Dogan, que era irlandés. O sea que alguna vez lo hemos dicho. Así que tiró la sangre ahí. Un gusto, buenas tardes.
Gracias, buenas noches.
Adiós, aquí buenas